and you'll be able to find the recording on the CIRCA website in a few days. For the presentation part of the webinar, viewers will be muted, but you can ask questions in the chat, and at the end we'll open up the mics so people can raise their hands and ask questions directly to our panelists. We're joined today by Doctors Shareen Hartel, Eleanor Ouimet, and Desen Ozkan, who will be talking about their recently submitted collaborative research proposal. Shareen Hartel is the Whitaker Ozkan. Oh, I knew I would mess that up. Let's see. Try it again. Whitaker Oskatesky, Chair of Human Rights and Professor of Political Science at UConn. She holds a joint appointment in the Department of Political Science and the Gladstein Family Human Rights Institute. Her research focuses on changes in transnational human rights advocacy and with a focus on labor and economic rights issues. Eleanor Ouimet is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology. Her research and teaching focuses on human-environment interactions, including community-based conservation, environmental justice, disaster preparedness, energy equity, and climate change. And Desen Ozkan is an assistant professor in chemical and biomolecular engineering who works on socio-technical engineering education, offshore wind, and sustainable energy development within a framework of justice, inclusivity, diversity, and equity in the engineering workforce. And I'd like to mention, too, that all of our panelists today are involved with UConn's Engineering for Human Rights initiative at the university. So, Shareen, let me turn that over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you to Luann and John and colleagues at CIRCA for involving us. It's an extraordinary privilege to be here, and I'm very eager for the conversation with all of you online as well. I also want to acknowledge my colleague Davis Chacon-Hurtado from the School of Engineering, as well as our Human Rights Institute, with whom I co-direct the Engineering for Human Rights initiative. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides by way of background. And I'll do some opening framing remarks before turning the conversation over to Elle, and then in turn, Desen. I'll be monitoring the slides throughout. Let me put them in presentation mode. And our goal today is to give you not only a sense of the grant that we've submitted and the team that we are part of in all of its multidisciplinarity, but also how each of us envisions our work intersecting with themes of human rights, environmental justice, and sustainability and equity. I should start then by saying, as a professor of human rights, I'm a scholar of human rights with a special focus on economic rights. And so for the benefit of everyone online, just to have a common lexicon or framework, a human right we typically consider a claim by someone on someone for something essential to human dignity. And the claiming can be done by individuals, or as Elle in her own research as an anthropologist will tell you, can be done by groups. A group can make a claim on someone or something or some entity for something essential to human dignity. When we talk about human rights, we have different types of rights. We have civil and political rights, which are very classic for people in the United States when they think of the right to vote, the right to participate in the political process, the right to physical integrity, to not be harmed. All of those are civil and political rights that can be violated very easily through acts of commission, direct assault. But then we have economic and social and cultural rights, which are a range of rights, right to education, to food, to health, to housing, where there can be aspects of discrimination that can certainly be on their face ascriptively assigned to people of particular groups, but also can be violated through lack of provisioning and lack of effective state delivery and or restraint of corporate and or other actors in society who might infringe on those rights. And so in our work on engineering for human rights, we look at this interplay between the process of engineering, as you heard in Desen's biosociotechnical processes that intersect with human beings' well-being. And in this particular project, we're drawing deeply on Elle's experience in community-based and participatory research strategies, which toggles in many cases with my own around labor and economic rights and Desen's as well, to map out how people can address questions of climate preparedness within the framework of economic justice and inclusion. And so that economic inclusion gets denominated in some ways in terms of human rights. We can make very specific claims when we link those claims to protections under national law, local law, and or international law, treaties that the United States or other countries have ratified. And so we think about engineering then through this broader framework of embedded engineering within a larger social context. What's exciting about that then, And I have to credit my colleague Davis for this piece, which has gained this particular slide, which has gained a lot of attention, both by our colleagues at UConn, but nationally and internationally. This type of approach lets us then think about different phases of engagement around promotion and protection of human rights. So we think about distributive justice. How do we distribute access to resources in a society? How do we distribute access to resources that might help us ensure energy justice and sustainability? How do we ensure participation? This is really integral to the next couple of slides that Elle will discuss in the process of mapping out what preparedness means. Who are the duty bearers, both private sector entities and or state entities, who are obliged to ensure that rights aren't violated and that there's a sufficient minimum floor of access to the resources that would enable people to enjoy safe and equitable access, in this case to climate resilience and preparedness strategies. And who do we hold accountable when processes and or institutions fail to protect people? And then finally, that these rights, these civil and political and economic and social and cultural rights, are highly indivisible. The types of ascriptive identities by race or gender orientation or disability that make people highly vulnerable in society can double down and in many ways make them even more vulnerable to climate injustice, to situations of precarity. And so those indivisible rights, the right to housing, to health, to transportation, et cetera, that engineers often work on from a technical standpoint, have these larger valences that are social and in many cases allow us to look through this lens of indivisible rights to more justly protect and promote those rights. So when we think about engineering for human rights, we're using this framework, which is largely legally derived, hence Luann's and our intersection in this work, but also then is through the lived experience and participatory experience of community members translated into practice so that they can make claims on government, on business entities, and on one another to ensure safety, to diminish precarity, and to ensure human full flourishing and human dignity. So that's the perspective that I come to as a political science professor who wears these two hats of political scientist and human rights scholar. And in my own work, which is largely around supply chains and community engagement in developing workforce and community participation in ensuring labor rights, I use this lens of economic justice, economic rights very centrally, and I'm really privileged to be part of a team of people using many different tools in promoting that work through this grant and through other shared research and teaching. So I'm going to now turn the floor over to Elle.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having us. So speaking about what Shareen is talking about in a big picture, in a more sort of specific context, Shareen, Desen, and I, along with Luann and John, but we've been working on a very interdisciplinary, cross-sectoral project to put forward a proposal to the Department of Energy through what they call their GRIP program, which is for Grid Resilience Improvement Program. And the whole notion of the GRIP program is really how do you reinforce the electric grid to withstand the prospect and the projections for climate change and climate risk, and how do you improve the resilience, specifically focusing on improving resilience, reliability for underserved, distressed communities, specifically focusing on the federal government's interest in what they call the Justice 40 communities, which have been mapped in large part through the Inflation Reduction Act. This particular project was put together in an interdisciplinary fashion led by UConn's Department of Engineering, and it includes engineering, political science, anthropology, natural resources and the environment, a number of faculty from across the university, but then also other universities, Southern Connecticut State. We have high school partners, which Desen will talk about in just a little bit. We have technical partners, we have utility partners, and we have a number of state partners, right, including the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, DEEP, and the Department of Economic and Community Development, DECD. And our whole overarching goal was to try to address the issue of inequity in Connecticut, which anyone that knows much about the nitty-gritties of Connecticut knows that our averages look good, right? Very rarely does the federal government see any sort of proposal from Connecticut and say, oh yeah, Connecticut's an area that needs a lot of help, or Connecticut's an area that suffers from climate change. We typically aren't on that list. But when we start to actually look at the specifics, we see that Connecticut actually is on the brink of tremendous climate change risk. We are also at this point of being at a really socioeconomic point of vulnerability, because Connecticut ranks second in the nation for wealth inequality by race and ethnicity. The segregation levels in Connecticut, the income inequity in Connecticut, as well as the lack of distributive justice when it comes to social services in Connecticut is stark. And there's a number of factors that play into that, in part because we don't have county level governance, but there's a number of factors that play into it. But what our effort is to combine all of these different stakeholders, right? State, academic, technical, utilities, companies, and community partners into a really cohesive statewide effort to address energy equity. And so our project was entitled Reinforce CT, Resilience Energy Innovation Network for Community and Energy Equity in Connecticut. And we were really, we were responsible for the community benefits plan side of this. And our goal was really, I think we can actually go to the next slide for that. Shareen, if you can just.
Sure.
Because I think the next slide might be, well, this is technical, right? So this is sort of, I won't talk too much on this, and Desen, actually, you can interrupt me if you want to. But what the technical aspect of this project was looking to do is trying to figure out how we could kind of at a really broad scale across the state of Connecticut increase the visibility of projected outages through the use of sensor data, and use these models, and by putting sensors across the state, but primarily in Justice 40 and distressed communities, and then putting technology and dashboards and interfaces in places like public libraries, so we could really start a means of communication so that there could be a faster level of predictive efforts to help alert communities when there are outages coming, right? As well as allowing community members, specifically those who are at the highest risk, to report their needs, to report their challenges, to report their experiences, not only with outages, but also with restoration. And to start also in creating programming across the state, largely again through community partners, through community centers, through community engagement and institutions that are already the places where people who need the most help seek the most help. Right, so working with these community partners, accessing community needs and challenges, making sure that community members have a means to provide us with information about what their aspirations for energy reliance, energy affordability, energy reliability really are, and have them also part and parcel of the effort to figure out how to do that most effectively, right? And so these were just some of the technical details in terms of using prediction models that have been developed by the faculty at the Eversource Energy Research Center at UConn, sensor data coming from technical partners, and then vegetation management to assess really how efforts to ensure that outages are decreased are actually moving and projecting those moving forward. So if you want to go to the next slide, that'll get to the community. So this is sort of the model for our community engagement piece. And really what we're trying to demonstrate here is that what we're trying to do is partner with community-based institutions, with municipalities, with high schools, colleges, universities, trade unions, and workforce alliances to build a system where we can work, like I said, with community institutions to provide preparedness programming to community members, provide access and information about workforce opportunities in the energy sector, to provide information about energy assistance programs. There's a number of solar assistance programs, as well as energy efficiency programs through a number of various entities across the state, right? Connecticut Green Bank has programs, DEEP has programs. And these are wonderful programs, but sometimes they're difficult to access. And if we look at sort of the inequity across the state of Connecticut, we see that those areas that need the most assistance in terms of energy reliability, those areas where outages actually do the greatest damage, because a power outage in one part of Connecticut means a great deal, something different to a power outage in another part of Connecticut, right? If you an hour of outages in Fairfield can make a much bigger impact to someone's life than, say, a power outage in Willimantic, where there may, you may perhaps have, your weekly income is in the freezer. And so losing that outage has a great difference in value depending on where in the state you're working and who you're working with. So we have to recognize that just, getting your biggest bang for the buck and getting the most people back online the fastest is not necessarily the way you need to go. We really need to pay attention to needs-based outages. So how do we work with community members to provide assistance, right? To provide clean energy information and assistance accessing those programs, whether it comes through application assistance, loan assistance, or even just information accessibility assistance, because oftentimes, like I said, those communities that need the greatest help have the least amount of support or full-time employees at that able to do so. So part of what we are also proposing to do with this project is to increase resilience and increase the access to information and increase preparedness, while simultaneously implementing technology to decrease outage frequency across the state. And then part of that process was also the idea that we really need to generate opportunities for community members to access and make inroads in educational opportunities and workforce opportunities. And when it comes to workforce, this is a huge emphasis on federal grants. And so when you're trying to access the funding from these federal agencies, one of the things they're really going to emphasize is workforce development. It's their mandate to do so, just as it's their mandate to make sure that the investments of these projects go towards Justice 40 and distressed communities. But from our perspective, it means much more than simply engaging with these communities in a superficial manner. It means actually implementing and integrating programming that will reach every aspect of a community and provide opportunities to people at every level of education or skill set or experience. And so I will actually turn things over to Desen to talk a little bit about the opportunity network that we attempted to develop, and then we can kind of return back to maybe talking about some of the challenges of when it comes to developing projects like this from an interdisciplinary perspective.
Perfect. Thank you, Elle, and thank you, Shareen and Luann and John. Yeah, so kind of, on the topic of the discrepancies sort of with thinking about how DOE or these departments, these federal funding opportunities are really emphasizing jobs and workforce. That's wonderful. But when we look at energy transition, when we look at kind of the utility, the energy sector, there aren't kind of homogeneous training mechanisms to actually have people be ready for all of these jobs. Each job is different, the sector is different. There's so much kind of complexity baked into what it means to have this sort of green workforce. And so this part of the project was us really trying to understand what that ecosystem or what those pathways look like and connect with those partners in Connecticut and really think about sustainable pathways for folks to have opportunities who had not had these opportunities before and be able to receive employment by the end. And so this little kind of pathway map with arrows everywhere, I'm sure is overwhelming, but this is kind of one of the things that we were able to garner, and I'll talk through the little pieces of it. So Shareen, if you can go to the next slide here. So kind of broadly, we looked at a couple of different pathways for people coming either out of high school or coming kind of broadly from the community, thinking about second career, thinking about new career, or coming from kind of an unemployed status. And so, Shareen, if you go to the next slide, this will be a lot of clicks, so I apologize. So if we think about kind of college, we looked at this opportunity that UConn has been heavily involved in early college experience to think about kind of college credit type courses on these different topics or pathways. And so one of the opportunities is to build the sort of sustainable energy access point to disseminate across high schools in Connecticut. And so this, can lead to you pursuing a university degree, thinking about other kind of various disciplines to then engage in energy sector. And through the project, we have different opportunities for students to gain this kind of experiential learning, either through library programming, industry partnerships, or internships, and other kind of energy related opportunities that they may not have had before. So next slide. And so similar kind of with the high school track, we also looked at the opportunity of kind of vocational training through the trades. And this was a really important partner for us of kind of connecting with the BTTI, Building Trades Training Institute in Connecticut, which houses a lot of different union apprenticeships, which is very rare kind of in the US to have all these different apprenticeships under one organization. And so this is another track that would really prepare folks to be kind of ready to work in the trades through apprenticeship and kind of take up these union jobs, which are being kind of agreed upon through project labor agreements for a lot of these bigger construction energy projects. Go to the next slide. And so one of the things that we kind of realized through a lot of these conversations with folks is that there's actually quite a gap in kind of high school educators that can do the sort of career technical education or industrial vocational education. And so one of the kind of circular pathways was to think about what about kind of folks in the trades who are close to retirement. What if we were able to create a pathway for them to come back into high schools or come back into this sort of next generation training? And so one of the pushes was to think about the licensure, getting kind of retiring age union members to be licensed with an 098 industrial education license through a kind of condensed program at UConn through NEAG and engineering to sort of build this kind of teaching capacity across Connecticut. And so this was kind of one of the opportunities where we were able to identify something based on conversations with partners, with high schools, and to think about what actually could we do to build a sustainable process rather than kind of have it be a one and done with the grant. So if you go to the next piece, and so community members, we also think about can go into the trades through these pre-apprenticeship programs, which are basically apprenticeship readiness, kind of getting folks ready for the 4-year program at a lot of these trades. Go to the next slide. And then another opportunity that is connected to the grant, and Elle, I think you might be able to say more about this, but thinking through like a specific utility sector program that Southern Connecticut State University and partnered with Gateway Community College have devised to really bring folks who are thinking about either a second career or a new career into the utility sector in Connecticut. And so this is a specific program that we've partnered with and are hoping to support through this project. Go to the next slide. And then this is the last one of kind of looking at the Connecticut Workforce Alliance, which has been doing so much kind of wraparound, really thoughtful, really integrated programming. And a lot of the work with us has been to learn about kind of existing opportunities and initiatives and try to build and to support what's already going on in the state. So we can move. And I'll let Shareen and I'll add to this, but some kind of takeaways and lessons learned. A lot of these connections really came from conversations with partners, with different companies or organizations. I think one of the big takeaways for me that maybe folks had as well was that not everyone kind of has the same vision or idea, even if they are in the same company or organization. And so part of the work is really learning about people and kind of relationship building with people rather than kind of seeing the companies or the organizations as a monolith. And then I think most folks would agree with this of just timelines in academia versus industry versus anywhere else are always kind of in sync or out of sync. And so that can be just an added struggle of thinking about a due date versus kind of other folks' internal or external due dates. And then I think lastly, I'll just say that the sustainability of processes like through people and through relationships really stuck out to me as kind of the priority rather than thinking about like what is a product, what is kind of a piece that we can deliver and be finished with. But especially with this notion of jobs and opportunities and education, these green utility jobs like don't exist perfectly and aren't on the same timelines as education. And so if we can really think about the opportunities as a pathway or an ecosystem, that can help kind of prepare this economic and educational system for the kind of green jobs, energy sector work that is coming, rather than kind of preparing people with short-term training for jobs that may or may not exist in the next few years. So I'll pass it back and we can wrap up.
I would add to Desen's kind of lessons learned here that this entire process is extremely political, and every stakeholder has a different agenda, and marrying those agendas is sometimes something it turns into something beautiful in a long-term relationship, and other times it's not feasible. And when you are working, and I really do credit the leads, the engineering team that initiated this proposal. I give them credit for really kind of bringing on what could really be described as sort of not a difficult, but Shareen, Desen, and I are we're social scientists. Well, Desen is not trained as social scientist. She does social sciences as well. She also is trained in engineering, so she has both. She's bridges both. But we really took very seriously the commitments that we were establishing with community partners. And when we're working with the Connecticut Library Consortium, when we're working with the trade unions, when we're working with Workforce Alliance, when we're working with high schools, we're working with community partners that have a huge amount at stake. And we are offering a commitment, a long-term commitment. And we need to be able to have honest conversations that are based in what can actually be delivered. And this is in conjunction with working with other partners who are more political, whether they are state entities or are more profit oriented because probably maybe they're tech companies, or maybe they're political because they are utilities dealing with regulatory issues. This map is very complicated. And so we found ourselves in some difficult situations trying to ensure that we were not promising beyond the capacity to meet our promises to community partners, while also kind of bringing them in so their input was informing what we were actually proposing with the team as a whole. And so that was a difficult place to navigate. But I do believe that in the end, recognizing that not every relationship is going to work is part of creating that sort of honest package.
The other thing that I would add to this that's really lovely to kind of wrap this up is also that each of us as scholars and, for want of a better word, policy wonks, has our relative area of expertise, but we often have to be humble enough to acknowledge that our partners have lived experience or industry experience or union experience that is vastly distinct. And we have to be humble enough to sit down, listen, and roll up our sleeves, and then collaboratively look at where we can make a match in the middle. So for example, we had hoped for a public labor agreement on this project. As Desen explained, those are multi-million-dollar project types within which you carve out a number of jobs that can be bid out to labor union actors. This job did not end up with a PLA, but it ended up with a significant commitment in the grant to long-term training, as Elle's slide showed, for union-based apprenticeship training. Many Americans don't realize it's as competitive to get into an apprenticeship program as it is to get into college. And the investment in an individual apprentice is tens of thousands of dollars a year. So we're also recognizing that this green energy frontier is one that's going to involve investment, where there are lots of different competitive pressures, the profit motive, the need for unions to show that they're meaningfully bringing jobs to the table for their members, the cost of training. And this, Elle mentioned the partners who we've been working with. Desen mentioned the early college enrollment program. Elle mentioned local high schools and others. They as well, with thousands of students, have some who will be able to get into an apprenticeship program and others who will need to go through a workforce training program and others who will be able to go straight to UConn and begin to embark on an engineering career. And those administrators are also feeling pressure from their school boards, parents, and others. So when we humbly say to them, what are your interests? We need then to be ready to think about how to be flexible in our program design. And this is, again, a grant proposal where we're trying to share the resources, would we win the grant, that will enable people to address their multiple stakeholders. So it's almost a question of, we talk about in political science, nested games. We have lots of games of negotiation happening simultaneously on multiple levels. And I think being open with each other, our communication flows were very open in our planning team, and winning people over to the idea that we weren't hoarding information. Information hoarding is a big problem in many different spaces, but that we were going to be very transparent about the information that was going into building the grant was also important. So humility and transparency, I would say, are two cardinal virtues that we really all had to buy into and then consistently convey to our partners. Because this trust building exercise, as Elle mentioned, we are the second most unequal state in the country. There's lots of lack of trust at the community level of government, of business, of unions, of neighbors. And so really wading in with a lot of humility and transparency to this process of conversation, I think is also a lesson that we've taken away. So I think maybe we defer to Luann as our convener on next steps in the process.
Sure, we're willing to open this up to questions. John is going to work on having all of our participants able to ask questions directly. He may take a moment to change that over, and while we're adding in the people, I have a question that I can ask to Elle in particular. And this is a question that I know is a challenge in many different disciplines, especially when you're talking about policy or other things that are difficult to measure. But can you talk about the challenges in this particular project about demonstrating or measuring the community benefits that you're trying to deliver?
Yeah, that was a big challenge, because actually one of the things that DOE prioritizes is metrics, right? How can you prove to us that the investments that we're putting into this are actually going to go to Justice 40 or distressed communities? How can you prove to us that you are going to get the results that you want? And part of that had, again, to do with making sure that we were working with a number of different types, data types, right? So one of the things that's really important in this project is ethnographic data collection, right? So that we are at every point. So at the onset of this proposal, at formative assessment and summative assessment is based on gathering data through focus groups and listening sessions, as well as statewide surveys, to assess community needs, challenges, aspirations, and goals. But then also integrating the extent of the efficacy of programming, the efficacy of clean energy assistance, the efficacy of engagement in the implementation of technology, the efficacy of recruitment programs into workforce programs, the efficacy of the high school's coordination with ECE. So there's assessments along the way. But what we also need to recognize is that we also need larger data, community-wide, statewide data on how well are we actually solving the problem of energy equity in Connecticut. So to that sense, we also have a large survey that we're building and that we're working closely with resource economics professors as well, building a survey to assess the dollar value of outage reductions, right? So like I said before, an outage reduction or an outage doesn't cost the same depending on the sociodemographics of those who are living through them. And so what is the holistic value of costs averted from a decrease in damages when it comes to the loss of wages, or the loss of access to subsidized school lunches, or the loss of resilience in a storm, or exposure to heat stress, exposure to cold. So how do we worked with surveys and survey metrics to come up with a method by which we could assess the dollar value of the holistic benefits stemming from a decreased experience of outages and the reduction in the duration of outages.
Great, thank you for that. I know this is such a challenging project. I'm just overwhelmed with the complexity that all of you have had to navigate and figure out, with not just figuring out the research plan, but all of the partners that are involved. It's a lot. But one of the things the university is trying to do is encourage these kinds of large grants that are complex and that do have a lot of moving parts and partners. And talking to my own children who have just either undergraduates about to go to college and just coming out, multidisciplinary work right now is really where the future is, because of these complex problems are ones that we're dealing with, whether it's socioeconomic problems, racism, climate change. All of these things are going to have these interdisciplinary solutions, if they'll have solutions at all. So could you talk about how, and this can be for any of you, whoever wants to jump in, how a grant like this, if it's funded, how a project like this opens the way to new kinds of research, as well as provides an avenue for the university resources to more directly deliver services to communities. So the things that you're trying to do are really providing direct benefits for people. And how do you think a project like this will help facilitate that mission of the university?
Desen, do you want to take that and I can follow on, or Elle can follow on?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah, the kind of interdisciplinarity aspect I think is present like in academia very like obviously, but then also in kind of any conversation that you might have with a human who sees the world a little bit differently from you. And I think that recognition, that humility that Shareen was talking about before, if that ends up being the foundation for relationship building, then there is this orientation to learning. But I think one of the issues that I see is just there's never enough time to learn or ask questions or be humble. So a lot of those kind of meaningful ways of building relationships gets lost because the deadline is in 2 weeks and no one has time to be a human and kind of like do this slow work. So I think that gets in the way a lot, and it can really like have big repercussions for how people collaborate, especially in engineering, where oftentimes social scientists are brought on at the end, like once the problem has been identified, once a lot of the kind of tasks have been identified for people of different disciplines, which is kind of counter to meaningful interdisciplinary collaboration. And so just that in and of itself, that setup really can be a disservice. And then to even go beyond the university into the community, that's a whole nother kind of level of actually building trust with community members who may have a perception of the university that is not so pleasant. So I think a lot of it is time and a lot of it is kind of that interpersonal relationship building that ends up being far more important for knowledge production than I don't know, fancy metrics sometimes. So
I think the success, I think Desen hit it on the head when she said that the promise that a project like this offers for the future and future growth and development of projects like this comes from that trust, right? Comes from the fact that and some of that is still to be determined. And Luann, conversations that we've had, and John as well, right? The idea that one of the roles in this, if we can play any sort of intermediary role, it's to establish that line of trusted communication between communities and municipalities and utilities and academics. And even within academics, then you have different departments who use different data types, who often have different perceptions of the validity of different data types. And so if we can enter into conversations preemptively to identify the needs and the way in which different partners can fill those needs for one another and inform the type of work and the outcomes, that goes a very long way. And I think that's been one aspect, and like Desen said, at the outset of this project, which was actually 2 years ago, there was a big presentation about like, this is the technology that we have to solve a problem. And there was a group of us who were social scientists that we said, you don't know the problem yet. You can't offer the solution before you know the problem, right? You can't put that cart first. And so going back to the drawing board, but also, having partners that were willing to say, okay, we'll slow down. We will go back to the drawing board. You lead, right? Let the community lead. Let the demands lead. Let the roots of inequality dictate where we need to be putting the most resources.
And I would just do as a genealogy or a historical kind of perspective. We are very lucky at UConn. I came here 20 years ago explicitly to be part of a human rights institute that was going to foreground economic rights. Many Americans don't understand what economic rights are. They have a vague sense of labor rights. They know unions exist, but they really don't understand this interrelationship between civil and political rights, which we're very good at thinking about in the US, and economic, social, and cultural rights, which are much more foregrounded in the developing world or in Europe. And the beauty was that for 20 years, a group of us have been beating the drum of economic rights. And then there have been really targeted hiring opportunities. Davis and Desen are part of this Engineering for Human Rights program of teaching and scholarship and community building that's been happening for almost 10 years. Elle was brought on for community environment interactions, strategic hire through the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. So you're creating a critical mass of people who already know each other and are excited to work together. 20 years in the making, really with the takeoff being about 10 years ago. And now if Davis or I or Desen go to a meeting with I'm not an engineer, but with Davis or Desen, people know that UConn is doing it. If Elle or I go to a meeting of colleagues in the social sciences and humanities, people are aware that our approach to human rights is very integrative here. And so I think we were very lucky that it started not only with creating relationships between people internally, but also with our students. There are multiple generations at this point. So I've had students for 20 years going out and teaching and doing research and work in this manner. Our partner at Southern Connecticut State University, our partners include alums who are doing economic rights related work there. So it's very exciting to me to be part of a community of folks in-house, and then to be part of a land-grant university that has an explicit mission to benefit the community. We're not on Mount Olympus. Anybody can enter the campus. These are resources that are to be put at the service of the community. And so as Elle said 2 years ago, people said, stop leading with the tech, start listening to the community. That's not a foreign concept in a land-grant school. The knowledge is supposed to be put at the service of human betterment, right? And at this point, environmental sustainability, as well as human and environmental interactions explicitly in the work that Elle does. So I think it's really about building a community of people internal to your institution so that you're not suddenly adding a social scientist and stirring, but that you're also building, in a sense, a humility about taking the knowledge back out into and iteratively working it through with the community. I certainly saw that in the case of our workforce development project portions of the grant. Members of the labor union movement or workforce development centers or K-12 partners would tell us this might or might not work. And we would have to adjust accordingly because they know better than we do their audience. So yeah, very, very exciting to have that articulated.
Thank you for that. Excellent answer. So for all of our other participants, are there any questions out there that you'd like to present to our panelists? You can raise your hand, or everyone should have the ability to unmute themselves if you'd like to just ask a question.
Don't be shy.
There's a lot to unpack here.
I think we also wanted to, oh, go ahead.
Okay, all right. Hi, I'm Mary Fisher. This is a very interesting project you guys are talking about. I was not very aware of it, so that's why I logged in, because I wanted to see what was going on, and I am interested in climate change, and my specific focus is on housing and home ownership. And I was wondering, where people live is obviously very connected to their access to energy and energy inequality. And I was wondering if there is any component to your already very large project that has any connection to housing and segregation, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's actually something that is really pressing, because when we start looking at what are some of the roots of the inequalities across Connecticut, so much of it also has to do with zoning regulations. And as you probably know better than any of us, right, in terms of what towns and where do towns actually allow the idea that there could be low income housing. And that's a huge issue, and that's a huge feeder into the reality of segregation in Connecticut, and where resources get allocated. And the resource base on a town by town basis is coming from tax dollars to the town, not from any sort of county level governance. So you end up having the towns that need the most assistance having the least amount of resources. And so that's been a really big emphasis for us. And that was a really big point of, I wouldn't necessarily say contention, but discussion in this grant, because from the federal side, the emphasis on put the investment in Justice 40 communities. From the utility side, they see their charge as decrease the number of outages, right? And those actually don't align. The greatest number of outages in Connecticut are not necessarily in our most distressed communities. That's where we came in, and we're like, okay, but do you see the cost differential? A short outage here versus a long outage here, right? Or do you see the difference in terms of cost per capita, right? The cost of energy per capita is much higher in minoritized communities than it is in predominantly white affluent communities. Right, so how do we address those metrics, like Luann was talking about earlier, that aren't superficially there just in the customer minutes of interruption, right? Because if you just go by the customer minutes of interruption, you're going to be putting the majority of your dollars in non-distressed areas because they're a little bit more rural and they have more trees and they have more frequent outages. So readjusting those metrics to identify those areas in greatest need for a flurry of reasons, right? One of which comes into housing inequality, was a big part of the social side, saying we need to readjust how we're investing in communities and identifying those areas that need the investment.
And I would say also, Mary, that was really interesting for me, the choice of libraries as points of contact toggles really well with Willimantic's library, for example, is going to serve not only hardcore urban, heavily minoritized by race poverty, but it's also going to help shoulder the burden for economically precarious, often elder and or disabled, highly rural, transportation bound people who are living in a home with a septic that's totally dependent on their ability to have their well powered by an electrical pump. And so fascinatingly, choosing a library in a place like a J40 community of Willimantic is also helping us address some of the real precarity of the rural poor who are not as easily don't map as easily onto the J40 designation. And I think the library emphasis helped us look at differing forms of precarity really well, because we were anecdotally, as Elle said, some of the richest data we've gathered, and this is something I can talk about at any point with Davis, my colleague with whom I co-teach our Assessment for Human Rights and Sustainability class. But when we've asked even students in our classes to talk about the different cost of a power outage, they not only mention their freezer, but they mention, especially our poor rural kids, the inability to have decent access to sewerage and the inability for family members with disabilities and using CPAP or other kinds of oxygen support to be able to breathe. And those kinds of anecdotes are incredibly helpful and persuasive when we talk about, as Elle said, moving our colleagues in a for-profit motive conversation away from simply seeing naked minutes of interruption to actually the disproportionate impact of that interruption on differing forms of racialized, ethnic, elder, ageist, and or disability related precarity. And that's often connected to low income housing, be it rural or heavily urban.
Yeah, the library aspect, I think I skipped over this part. So the initial part of this project is going to have preparedness programming, clean energy extension assistance, and predictive modeling in initial 4 public libraries and Justice 40 communities in Connecticut. And we chose libraries specifically because they function as sort of that last town green, where it crosses age, it crosses socioeconomics, it crosses ethnicity status, it crosses all sorts of categories, and it allows a space of trusted accessibility, information, and assistance, when it comes from childcare to printing services and application assistance. So we chose that as a space, as a conduit of information and assistance for community.
I think that is so cool and innovative. I'm on my library board in my town, and we've had a lot of the same conversations about, and I'm always the social scientist kind of bringing up some of these points about like how this is such a fantastic third space and all of that. And I love how you are in building on that to, I mean, they already are a provisioner of social services, but you're doing it in a very like thoughtful and a bigger, more impactful way.
Well, they deserve the assistance.
Kind of realizing the potential there in a big way.
Yeah. And I would say Davis can chime in here, but we did an energy ingathering with community members over a year ago now. Lyle Scruggs was deeply involved, Mary, in that. And people literally said to us, you should have an extension program. You guys do it for chickens and necropsies. Why don't you do this for energy? We don't know who to trust if they say they're going to come put solar panels on our house. We don't know who to listen to. There are a bunch of people out there trying to take our money. It was fascinating to hear them say, you have an obligation to us through your extension. Do it through the library because we know the information will be credible. People in the community are saying this. We're not on Mount Olympus making it up. They trust their libraries, and they do believe that there is bad information out there and there's good information out there, and that the library will help them distinguish and discern between those two. And they have a lot of skin in their game because, as Elle said, once their freezer goes down, they lose all the investment that they've made in that food. And so folks will give you examples that are incredibly compelling, that because we're an interdisciplinary team, we'll then build into the grant. Hopefully we get it. But part of what I love about this project is it's saying to all of us, these different forms of knowledge are useful. This horizontality of knowledge production is really important, that the models won't work unless they can be more fine-grained with two-way communication between the scientists in the Eversource Energy Center and community members. So that in and of itself is a really fascinating turn that I think all of us who've come of age in academia of the past 2 decades are seeing the shift to the most exciting, most innovative research and teaching happening when people are willing to break the mold a little bit. And I think this kind of grant's exemplary of that.
Thank you very much. We are at time, and I really appreciate all of our panelists who have come out today and really talked about this fascinating and innovative research program, hopefully, that will get funded at UConn. And for everyone who's on the call today, too, want to remind everybody that on Thursday, if you did not get enough of Dr. Ouimet, which no one ever does, you can see her again on Thursday at this time, talking about climate justice and equity and public health and emergency management, another of her fascinating research areas. So thank you all for showing up today, and please visit the CIRCA website later this week if you'd like to see the recordings of this or any of our other research seminars. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Great
Thanks,
day.
everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.